All right. So, yeah, so welcome everyone to this Dionysus Circle event. My name is Sam Bennett, and I'll be moderating today. We are honored to have today Mateusz Stróżyński with us to discuss his new book, Plotinus on the Contemplation of the Intelligible World, Faces of Being and Mirrors of Intellect. It was published by none other than Cambridge University Press. So Mateusz's book, it's a really remarkable book. I highly recommend it. And he's kind of striving to develop a living Platinian philosophy for our times. In it, he explores the fall of the soul and a kind of the first person experience of fallenness in Plotinus. He distinguishes kind of the fall of the soul from the descent of being, which, hopefully we can talk about. He also kind of describes the first phase of our journey back to the source of all reality, the good, through the lens of Plato's Sophist and its specifically the great kinds. And the book is not only philosophically rigorous, but it's also very beautifully written. I think there's a lot of literary citations in there, ranging from Dante to Tolkien to William Blake. So yeah, so without further ado, welcome Mateusz, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, yeah. And just real quick, before we dive in, I'm just going to mention basically the structure of this is, I'll start things off with a question or whatever, a couple questions, but just please feel free to chime in with your questions or thoughts at any time. The goal is definitely to have just a more natural, fun discussion. So just anytime you have any thoughts, please jump in. If you need something clarified, yeah, just jump in and go for it. So I thought we might want to start, Mateusz, with just can you kind of just provide us a little bit about yourself? Specifically, I'm noticing I think not only are you a philosopher, but you're also, I guess, kind of described as a classicist. And then as well, I saw that you are a psychotherapist, and then I looked up on YouTube, and I think I also saw you doing some classical music singing. I'm not sure, maybe that was someone else, but anyway, it just seems like you're involved in a lot of different things. Oh, I think you're also the editor for Antigone Journal. So anyway, if you could just kind of describe a little bit about yourself, that'd be great.
Well, yeah, I'm a classicist, but I also studied philosophy, and I was in particular interested in ancient philosophy. So my focus was really classics or philosophy, ancient philosophy from the perspective of classics, because there wasn't a lot of ancient philosophy in the philosophy department. But these were two separate departments that I studied in. But I wrote my MA thesis in philosophy was about Plato, and in classics I've continued my studies in a PhD program writing about Plotinus. At the same time I was studying classical singing in a music school, but I was never a professional singer in the sense of earning money by singing, but sometimes I perform in concerts on different occasions, and then after I completed my PhD, I started to teach at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, the western part of Poland, and I started to study psychology and then psychotherapy, psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So I became it's like a parallel career for me.
Interesting.
I became a psychotherapist. I see patients. Also, I'm also a teacher and supervisor of psychotherapy in a method called transference focused psychotherapy, which was developed by psychoanalytic psychotherapists from New York mostly. So I'm doing all these things as you mentioned. Now I'm associate professor at the university and a psychotherapist, but also I co-founded the journal Antigone, and I'm still an editor of this great.
Awesome. Sorry, there was a little bit of lag there, but my apologies. But Awesome. That's great. Yeah. So you're okay. So you're teaching in Poznan right now, but you grew up in is it Wronki? Is that
Yeah.
right? And that's not too far from Poznan, I think, right? And
So 60 kilometers. Wronki
okay.
is a small town, like 10,000 people, which is around 60 kilometers to the north of Poznan. So I
Okay.
spent there childhood. I started high school in Poznan, and then I went there to study as well. But before high
Hmm.
school, I was living there with my
Okay.
parents. I grew up in the 1980s because I was born in 1979.
Right. And so that would still be under communist rule, right? The first
Yeah,
so
very
many
much
years.
so.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
the regime wasn't extremely violent or cruel at the time, apart from martial law period in 1981 and 2. This is where there was real violence and killing and imprisoning the opposition,
Hmm.
persecuting Catholic Church, things like that. But then in the 1980s was like a slow period of rotting for the regime. And yeah, but I was born in a communist country, so I know all about communist ideals, equality,
Hmm.
equity, and these kind of things. Yeah, so yeah, and of course, in comparison to America or Western Europe, it was a relatively poor country. We didn't have a phone, we didn't have a much of a car. Of course, we didn't have a house or anything close. Um, yeah, so that was, but I took this as normal
Hmm.
as a child. Yeah, but my mother, she spent a year in the States in 1966. Our distant family lived there, so my mother raised me in this kind of America worship almost. Everything was
Hmm.
perfect in America because she of course she was comparing this to Poland, to communist Poland. So everything was perfect. Commercials during movies, my mother would say, that they have this marvelous things called commercials. You can go and take some ice cream from the fridge while you're watching the movie. So for me it was this very idealized picture of America and in general
Yeah.
the West. Yeah, but of course then in the 1990s I began to go abroad and to visit other countries, including the States.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. It's not perfect, but it's very close. No, I'm just kidding. No. So that's interesting. So I just find it kind of interesting as like someone who grew up in a communist country like that, where obviously the Marxist materialist kind of perspective of a communist country, and yet here you are, a Platinian scholar, which is like a Marxist worst nightmare. I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of the naturalism. It's very far from a naturalist materialist worldview, and so kind of in that environment that you grew up in. Um, I'm kind of curious. Was it kind of a pious environment where did people subscribe to materialism and naturalism at that time, and where you
Well,
grew up, or was it?
actually, in the town where I grew up in Wronki, there was an infamous prison, uh, and so during the Stalinist period, it was a prison where the communists would keep like war heroes who didn't become communists after the World War II. So like war heroes or people fighting in the Warsaw Uprising, they just put them in jail, tortured and executed, basically often without any process. So this, the town was in the shadow of that huge prison. So when I was a kid, it was just a regular prison. But my parents were involved in, especially later after the fall of communism, in bringing back the memory about the communist crimes perpetrated in the prison. So because it was a small town, so a large portion of population was the families of people who were working in that prison. So probably, I mean, my parents would say that it was the town was more communist than average because for these reasons. But I was raised in a very anti-communist family. So my grandfather spent several months in prison in 1950s, and my parents were teachers, and they were really marginalized, isolated, and persecuted in their respective schools because of their anti-communist stance. So I was raised anti-communist, and we were Catholics, maybe not, I wouldn't say very pious, but we attended Mass on Sundays. So I think it wasn't very likely that I would sort of absorb materialism or Marxism, because I was raised in a very simple worldview. Communism is pure evil, and atheism is tied to communism. So actually, it's interesting that when I travel to the States or to the UK, and I see like many students interested in Marxism. I can see posters at the universities encouraging some discussion groups about Marxism. It's still surprising to me, but I think that if you haven't gone through it, you may think it's a nice idea, and you may feel fascinated by materialism and atheism, the science, this kind of stuff. But I grew up in a state which was officially atheist and materialist and about the science, and I knew that it was cruel violence against all opposing people. So I didn't feel any peculiar attraction to it. Although when I was 16, I became an atheist, and I was an atheist for 7 years, which now I think it was a kind of a adolescent rebellion. Instead of doing more external things, I rebelled internally against my parents and all of that. So so there was a period when I would be an atheist, but it wasn't connected to communism or any scientific materialist ideology, nothing like that.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, and wow. Okay, so you were an atheist for a few years. I'm kind of curious. Like, I wanted to ask, about your kind of research profile, where on the one hand, you have a deep interest in Augustine, obviously a foundational Christian figure, and Plotinus, who is a pagan philosopher. And I was kind of curious about how you kind of reconcile those dimensions, those influences. It's also interesting to me to think about in our time where sort of pagan influences is gaining a larger influence on the culture. You see rising numbers of people practicing paganism. I suppose in the Olympics controversy, there's kind of more of a symbology of paganism. So anyway, I'm just kind of curious about how you reconcile those kind of two dimensions of your research.
Okay, so my interest in philosophy was in a way parallel to me becoming atheist in high school. But the first author that I started to read was Plato. Then I started to read Heidegger. I didn't understand anything, and I thought it was very cool. This is the real deal. I can't.
That happened to me too, by the way. Yeah,
I can understand Plato, but I can't understand Heidegger. So this must be the ultimate revelation. But so I was interested in Plato from the very beginning. So he was the protreptic to philosophy, really. And then later I became interested in Plotinus, and then Augustine. So I sort of started to study Augustine because I wanted to understand Plotinus better. And then I was studying Plotinus in order to understand Augustine better. And so it keeps going like that, because and so clearly my conclusion is that those two brilliant thinkers, they really illuminate one another
Okay.
This is my intellectual and spiritual experience at least. So yeah, I was interested in Plotinus and his mysticism, his contemplative philosophy. Yeah, so again, it was in parallel with my conversion and my sort of journey back to Christianity, because I was interested in mysticism in general. I was interested in various things initially, like the Kabbalah, Sufism, Hindu and Buddhist mysticism, these kind of things, and also Plotinus. And then I was drawn back to Christianity. So I thought that Plotinus is a kind of metaphysics that can be baptized, like Augustine did it and other church fathers. Yeah, and I still think that Plotinus is, well, like Augustine did, that Plotinus is a kind of true metaphysics, which with some corrections can be fully embraced by Christian Platonists or Christian philosophers.
Right.
Yeah, and you mentioned paganism. I think it's really difficult. Well, now we live in a period of time where you can give any meaning you want to any term. That's very confusing. So I don't know what paganism means. So if sometimes says that they are practicing,
that's fair.
They are pagans. I have simply no idea what they mean. And I'm a bit skeptical whether you can really say that people practice, that the culture has become pagan, because a very, very simple illustration. I mean, paganism for me means the worship of the powers of nature, the cosmic powers like love, death, marriage, childbirth, things like that. So if you worship Hera, for instance, the goddess of marriage, I don't think you would treat marriage as a business contract. So
Right.
In fact, treating marriage as a business contract, I think pagans would consider a serious offense to Hera or Juno. And we know that the Greek gods are pretty vengeful when you encroach on the yeah. So what I mean. I mean, what we do now is this technological, mechanistic worship of our own self, or our own false self. I don't know if this is really paganism, because pagans, the cosmic powers were so much greater than themselves, and they would literally prostrate. Right. We prostrate only to the self, to our only deity, which Plotinus and Augustine described very brilliantly and precisely what that is. Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, sometimes I have friends who will say like, oh, the culture is becoming pagan, and I'm like, well, that would be an advance on what we I think. I mean, just in terms of at least having that element of worship. I mean, that's actually, personally speaking, like, I think when people talk about, oh, X or Y is a new religion, like, let's say I don't know, like critical theory or wokeness, people will say, oh, that's like a new religion, basically. The one thing I worry about is like, well, does it actually have that element of worship? Maybe they're worshiping themselves potentially, but even there, I kind of wonder, what is it? Yeah, basically, I'd be curious, what's like the philosophical criterion for saying this is an act of worship?
But sociologically, it's a kind of you can say it's pseudo religion from the perspective of, say, Emile Durkheim, for instance.
Okay.
He famously said that what happened during the French Revolution was a kind of a religious movement. So and Leszek Kołakowski, in his 3-volume analysis of the history of Marxism, he also said that Marxism was a kind of a pseudo religion. But so from that sociological perspective, you can say that. But if you look at the ancient and medieval philosophers, I mean, for them, religion was really the worship of the divine. Like if you read Aquinas, what he says in his Summa about religion, I mean, religion is like our inner attitude towards the divine and external actions flowing from that. So I would stick to that definition of religion. Well, people tend to see religion nowadays as almost a philosophy, like a doctrine. So there are religions which are separate systems, intellectual systems in which you have to believe. But I don't find almost anything like that in antiquity, even in the Middle Ages. So Plotinus, the religion which was irreconcilable with the religion of Augustine. I mean, Augustine would say Plotinus had a bad religion because he didn't even worship the gods very much. I mean, Porphyry was really a religious late antique pagan, but he complained that Plotinus, said, I won't go to the gods, to the temples to worship gods. Gods should come to me. These kind of like Zen koans. So I think that, but there is a lot of metaphysics and philosophy. And for Christians, Christianity was a philosophy. For Augustine, for Gregory of Nazianzus, I mean, for Maximus the Confessor, I mean, Christianity was the true philosophy, the perfect, complete philosophy. Yeah, so this is the way I'm trying to look at these things.
Yeah, great. Good. So yeah, my next question, I think, is kind of getting more directly at the book. But does anyone want to jump in? Anyone have any comments or thoughts about all this stuff? Okay, cool. Well, So
I would say, I mean, just to follow up on that, I would say that Christianity is really, maybe it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but Christianity is like Plotinus plus the incarnation and plus the biblical revelation, minus certain things. But
yeah, maybe we could get into that like later, the minus. But that's good. Yeah, okay. So your book, like I said, Plotinus on the Contemplation of the Intelligible World, Faces of Being and Mirrors of Intellect. So yeah, could you kind of just start by talking about what are the central aims of the book, and then what did you want to achieve in writing it, and maybe at some point we can also kind of talk about like some of the key terms in the title, just the intelligible world, faces of being, mirrors of intellect. But anyway, yeah. So central aims of the book.
I wanted to write a book about contemplation and Plotinus's philosophy in general. But it proved too long. First I included the one, but then it was too long. So I sort of focused on the contemplation of the intelligible world. Plotinus says this is the first phase, first in our journey back home, or our journey back to the good. We have to first arrive into the intelligible world and have a firm footing there, or even we have to learn how to abide there, basically on a permanent basis. And then from that, we can try to get to the experience of the good. So this is the subject of the next book. But this one ends with the contemplation of intellect being. And the main idea is what I call the first-person perspective in metaphysics and the third-person perspective in metaphysics. So the third-person perspective is when we look at reality as an it, so something to analyze, to observe, to discuss, to understand in concepts using discursive thinking, and this has always been a part of philosophy, the Greek philosophy, I guess. The idea that we have to not only understand reality, but put like to express our understanding of reality in concept, to give a logos, to use how Plato would put it. And but it was never that. And Pierre Hadot was a great influence on me when I was in my PhD studies, because Hadot, he insisted that, in addition to that, there was always this practical side of philosophy. So philosophy is a way of life. Philosophy is spiritual exercise. Yeah. So I call metaphysics from the third-person perspective is looking at reality through the lens of concepts and logos, in the sense of human thought, trying to laid out some kind of doctrine. Although I don't believe that the Greeks created systems in the sense that, Hegel or Schelling tried to create a system, but a kind of a doctrine about reality. But the first person perspective in metaphysics is not a doctrine about reality. It's not an attempt to just understand reality and then express this understanding in concepts. This is just an experience of reality. And people can have this first person experience without being philosophers. So if you think of, say, Christian monks going to the desert like Anthony the Great, he clearly had a first person experience of metaphysics, a very powerful one, an experience of contemplation, but he wasn't interested very much in laying out a doctrine or anything like that. And there are also philosophers like Proclus, who are very keen on giving this, well, maybe Proclus created a system after all, so to describe reality in concepts. But when you read Proclus, it doesn't seem that he had this kind of profound experience like Plotinus or Augustine or, Gregory of Nyssa, Basil the Great, and Origen, and other people like that. So what I found fascinating in Plotinus is that there is an almost incomparable balance between the first person and the third person views. So in Plotinus's philosophy, you can see it's not that he describes his doctrine and then occasionally he mentions contemplation. That was kind of a traditional approach, and I think still is to a certain extent. So there are certain passages in Plotinus which are about mystical experience or contemplative experience, however you want to put it. But in general, he's this decent Greek philosopher, describing reality and concepts and arguing for it rationally and things like that. But I think it's not the case. So contemplation is omnipresent. It's everywhere. It's the source of conceptual discourse, and conceptual discourse circularly leads us back into this experience. So I don't think there are many authors who can reach this kind of balance as Plotinus did. And both aspects, so the first person, the third person perspectives, they nourish each other. They are interwoven seamlessly. So that's like the overarching methodological or initial approach or idea. But then I tried, of course, to describe various layers of contemplation in Plotinus, starting from his views on the descent of being and the fall of the soul, because contemplation is, for Plotinus, the way to get back from the fall, back home to the fatherland, to the intelligible world, and to the good ultimately.
Great. So maybe just to start off then, could you kind of distinguish contemplation from, so the way you just described that makes me think that, okay, if I just do a rational deduction, if I produce a conceptual argument, like, so for example, let's say I'm like, if the one is, then it's a part of being, let's say I perform some sort of deduction, that doesn't count as contemplation necessarily. With the word contemplation, we mean something more like closer to mystical experience necessarily. Like, is that right?
Yeah, but it's that there are no clear-cut boundaries anywhere. So
okay,
I think if you look at Augustine, because I warned you that I think Augustine can eliminate Plotinus. So Augustine uses really a lot, words like, or the word videre, to see. He says for him, the entire project of philosophy and theology is to see the truth. And so for Augustine, I think for Plotinus, to think is to really to see. So the purpose of discourse is always to see something. And of course, you begin with first principles, which you have to see. You cannot argue for first principles. So in this sense, even normal rational thinking, like metaphysical thinking or mathematical thinking, it begins from seeing, and goes towards seeing through the flashes of seeing all the time. So Simone Weil, she has this wonderful description that reason, and reason she understands as this kind of conceptual discursive faculty. So reason is like cleaning a window in order to see what is behind the window. So the function of reason is just to get rid of dirt, and then you just see. So she says, in order to, you have to get rid of the uncomprehended in order to see the incomprehensible. So in order to see reality intuitively, directly, you have to get rid. She is more radical than Plotinus, I think, because for Simone Weil, the great French mystic and philosopher, of course. So for her, the function of reason is negative. So to get rid of mistakes and errors. But we can also see this as a kind of still clearing out the window, but also getting these flashes of intuition, because if we understand something, we have this aha moment. It's always a moment of seeing. But whether to call it contemplation in this Plotinian sense, I would hesitate, because for him, contemplation is basically a gradual identification from the perspective of knowledge, because he has these three, I think, aspects. We can talk about this in a minute, but from the point of view of knowledge, contemplation means a growing first kinship and then identification, union with what is known, until you transcend knowledge completely in contemplation of the good, which I don't write about in the book. So if you want to test, you know, if you want to have a test for what is contemplation and what is not, is whether you experience what you see or experience or realize side of you and as you, basically, especially in the farther reaches of that process. So for instance, Aristotle, so just let's use Aristotle, because he's often, I think, erroneously considered to be this kind of cerebral, conceptual philosopher, not very contemplative. But Aristotle on the soul, he says that soul is all things, right? So, and he says, when you see anything, you are what you see. This is not Plato, this is Aristotle actually saying that. Of course, Aristotle says, if you look at the stone, you are the stone is in you. Of course, not the stone with matter in it, but the form of the stone. He clarifies this. But still, look at the stone, and are you the stone at the moment or not? So if you are seeing reality as being inside your consciousness and gradually becoming identical to your consciousness in the act of seeing, in the act of knowledge, that's what Plotinus calls contemplation. But of course, it develops in time, it's evolving, and these initial flashes, they are also the part of the journey.
Good. Great. Okay. That's really helpful. Excellent. So, I mean, that kind of brings us into this, you know, key idea that you kind of begin your book with. I think it might be, you know, you might open the book with this quote that from Ennead 3, which is that, you know, maybe I could share it to everyone. See if I can share it in the chat. Suppose we said, playing at first, before we set out to be serious, that all things aspire to contemplation. And so, yeah, so I mean, this suggests that, yeah, that there's an aspiration, a desire for contemplation from all things, you know, even plants, the earth. And then you go on to say, you know, but it's not only an aspiration, also for Plotinus, it almost seems to be the case that contemplation is interchangeable with being itself. So, and actually, one point you say, So it's not only that all things want to contemplate, and it's not only that the source of all things is from contemplation. So it's like everything wants to contemplate, the source of everything is contemplation, but all things somehow are contemplation. So you have like desire for contemplation, the source of all is contemplation, and then finally things somehow are contemplation. So yeah, can you kind of introduce us to this quote and some it seems like the aspiration of contemplation might be something that people previous to Plotinus would have maybe been on board with, maybe Aristotle and potentially would have.
Yeah, well,
but
of course, Plato and Aristotle were his main sources, but really he's becoming more and more radical. But on the one hand, a strange claim that everything is contemplation or everything contemplates. But in a minute I will suggest that it's not that radical if you take seriously into account Plotinus's metaphysics, or any metaphysics, the entire pre-modern Christian metaphysics, in fact, would make us accept this claim. But if we begin from a sort of a natural pre-philosophical attitude, we look around at the external world, so that there is this huge world outside of us. We are in our head, we are looking out through our eyes, like through windows, at this vast world, the sky, the clouds, the sun, the moon, other people walking. We live in a very artificial world when we compare it to Plotinus. We are surrounded by artifacts.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm surrounded by chairs and tables and books and papers and my computer and phone here and the keys. Plotinus wouldn't be as much, I think. But so we are looking around from inside of our body or inside of our head, and we think, what is he talking about? In what sense everything is contemplation? I mean, maybe I can contemplate, be conscious, I'm aware of this or that, I can think, but the table, the chair, I mean, the tree outside, I mean, the dogs and cats, I mean, what does it mean? And we look, I mean, today especially, we look up and we see the stars, the sun, the moon. It's all dead. There is no life in it. We are surrounded by this huge mass of deadness, which doesn't shock us anymore. But Blaise Pascal, who was one of the geniuses of our tradition, I mean, he said, I'm terrified of these spaces, because for him these spaces were no longer suffused with life and intelligence, like for Plotinus. So yeah, we live in a dead world. This huge bulk of what we call matter surrounds us. And from this perspective, this is a ridiculous idea that everything is contemplation. But then Plotinus says, but this is exactly the fall of the soul. The soul has lost its wings. We crawl on earth like some reptiles or things like that. We crawl on earth. We no longer have the ability to fly like contemplative eagles. So that's why we think that the world, the universe, is not contemplating, or it's not contemplation. This is the result of the fall, as I elucidate in the course of the book, because Plotinus, being for Plotinus, is interchangeable with knowledge, with knowing, or with, we could say, awareness or consciousness, and if we understand these terms very broadly. So for Plotinus, to be means to be aware. To be means to know. And actually it's on these lowest levels of reality where things seem to be devoid of consciousness. And Plotinus, he sometimes says, there are things which are inanimate, there are things which are devoid of consciousness, but he always will say, but from a certain point of view, you know, even the stones grow, or even the stones. So he's not, I don't think he's a panpsychist in the sense that he believes that every single stone has a soul. I don't think so. But for Plotinus, real being is intellect being. So if you look from that perspective, there's nothing strange in saying that everything contemplates. It depends what you mean by everything. If by everything you means this heap of material chunks that we call the universe now, of course, only human beings, you know, on this tiny little planet, we maybe sometimes aspire to contemplation. But for Plotinus, he reverses this perspective entirely. I mean, the whole reality is filled with consciousness, love, desire, knowledge, and yeah. So this is a completely different world.
Yeah.
And he says that the goal of philosophy is to get to that world, where everything is contemplation, from the world where everything is dead, inert, lifeless, stupid, which is the modern world.
Okay, yeah. So that's really helpful. So I'm kind of seeing some options, it seems like, for me. So okay, so you know, the hypothesis, or the idea that all things are contemplation. It seems like one route, as you mentioned, would be a more panpsychist route, where we try to say that somehow, in some sense, everything is, you know, even inanimate things are engaging in contemplation. And it sounds like you're saying, you know, Plotinus wouldn't exactly be subscribing to that sort of panpsychist position. Another idea is, okay, yes, there are inanimate things seemingly, but maybe they don't really rise to the level of genuine being. So when we say that all things are contemplation, what we're saying is that the true being, what truly exists, is more so intellect, soul, and that's contemplating. So it's like, yeah, inanimate things are not literally contemplating, but they're just shadows of being, you know. So that seems like another option. A third option I was thinking was like, you know, you know, if you're just a sort of traditional theist, I guess you could say that, well, how is God creating this whole world? It's in his mind. He's contemplating it. So in some sense, even the rock is contemplation, insofar as it exists only insofar as it is contemplated by the mind of God, potentially. So those are kind of like three options but it seems like maybe Plotinus doesn't fit into either of those threes. It's maybe something more stronger than those, or I'm not sure. How would you put it?
Yeah, well, one thing is that definitely you have to take into account this whole hierarchical vision of reality that we completely lost in 17th century, I guess, about that. So now we live in a flat world, when you have like the material universe and God, for instance. This is almost instinctive. We are taught to see, even Christians are taught to see the universe like that. But Plotinus has this hierarchical, like Dionysius the Areopagite, obviously, a very hierarchical vision of reality, where what we take to be the world is just like the lowest, the most tenuous aspect of reality. We just are unable to see more of that. Plotinus says in 6.9, it's like someone has feet in water. I mean, the sensible world is under the water. It's our feet. So I mean, that 90% of our being is in that higher world, which we are completely oblivious of. This is a great paradox of the fall. But the key idea is what I call mirroring principle. You could speak about participation here. So the inanimate things, what are they? They are the less real images in a whole series of images flowing from the good. Only the good is not an image. Everything apart from the good is an image. Intellect is an image. Soul is an image of intellect. Nature is an image of soul. The sensible world is an image of nature. And so in a sense, because an image participates in archetype, and in fact, everything that is real and this is again classical metaphysics, you find it in all authors after Plotinus as well, everything that is real in an image is the archetype. The only difference between an image and the archetype is that the image is not the archetype. It's an appearance, a revelation, an expression, a manifestation of the archetype, however you want to put it. So it's like Plotinus uses the image of water or mirror surfaces reflecting things, although he says it's an imperfect image. But yeah, from that perspective, yeah, and I use this Zoom illustration, which is maybe not felicitous, but you know, I'm talking to you right now, right? But someone could look at me and say, I'm talking to a screen. I'm talking to a moving image on a screen. I don't even know if that's you, right? Maybe it's artificial intelligence creates your image. So, but in a sense, so what appears on my screen or what appears on your screen is not my body. It's an image. But the whole reality of what you see and what you hear right now flows from my real being, and I can assure you that I exist apart from the Zoom conversation. So the entire reality, so the entire reality of it is not in the image, right? So from that perspective, you can say that sensible beings, which Plato called, of course, non-beings, which doesn't mean that they don't exist, but they are not true beings. They are these images which are constantly dynamically produced by higher archetypes, and they all the reality, all their intelligibility, and they participate in that. So you can say that, well, animals obviously have some kind of consciousness, and they participate in higher archetypes, which are fully intelligent. So animals, by participation, they have some share in intelligence. And plants, even, I mean, plants are produced by the Platonic forms and Plotinus. They are intelligent persons, I would say. So the plant, by being a plant, it participates in something intelligent. So it has a share in intelligence. Even stones or minerals or whatever, particles, physics, because they participate in intelligent levels of reality that produce them, they can be said to contemplate to a certain, or aspire. I think what Plato says, they aspire to contemplation because every image is sort of returning towards its archetype and everything towards the good. So even that hierarchical view allows us to say that the world is really permeated by consciousness and knowledge and light, and only if you look at the shadows and you exclude the archetypes, then you get this dead, meaningless, flat world that we see in our fallenness. But your third point, I think, yeah, it's not just the good and the material world, or God and the material world. For Plotinus, the great cosmic principles are intellect, soul, and also nature. Nature is the daughter of the soul and part of soul in any case. So you have these cosmic principles whom Plotinus compares to Greek gods. He says intellect is Kronos, soul is Zeus, sometimes soul is Aphrodite, nature, he calls her this great goddess Physis, nature. And for him, these are personal, intelligent beings. He says divine beings in a very broad sense. And modern Christianity, of course, says, well, that's paganism. Let's get rid of that. There's just God and the physical universe, right? well, no. What about the angels? I mean, this is a very, very strange thing, the disappearance of angels in modernity. Aquinas says somewhere that the more perfect a being is, the more numerous it is. So God creates more angels than inanimate things because they are more perfect. So what is reality? What is the universe? What is reality for a Christian? Reality is primarily, we would say, the angels. The reality is the great city of the heaven above heavens, like Augustine says, the great city of angels, heavenly Jerusalem. And there are certain angels of the lowest kind who have bodies, and that's us. And in us, there is the whole sensible universe. It participates in us, but we are a part of this. Augustine calls it in Confessions, book 12, creatura spiritualis, or creatura intellectualis. For him, the reality is primarily this intellectual creature, which he, of course, takes from Plotinus. And then there is the material or bodily creation, but it's not on par with the angelic reality. I mean, where did we get this idea from that angels are, maybe there's like a dozen of angels flying around? No, angels are more existing, more intensely existing than rocks and trees and animals. We just don't see them. And we don't believe in them anymore. So I would say that what Augustine did was he translated Plotinus's cosmic principles and his view of intellect as being composed of many, many intellects. He translated this into the biblical concept of the angels. So if you want, Augustine didn't do it, but if you want, you can, I guess, say that what Plotinus calls the world soul or nature, you can say these are kind of intelligences that are active in the universe. And you can find it in Augustine and in Gregory of Nazianzen, Basil the Great, and Origen, and all these people, they took it for granted that the whole universe is filled with these angelic powers. Right?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of directions we could go there. Does anyone want to jump in, by the way? I just want to make sure, feel free. Yeah, Quentin, sure.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So one question that sort of popped into my mind as you were discussing sort of the hierarchical ordering that sort of has been sort of lost as we've entered into, I think you said, the 1700s. Do you think, one thing I was wondering is that maybe Christianity plays a role in that sort of flattening things out, and specifically with respect to contemplation, because I think of someone like Plato, and in Plato's Republic, there's a very sharp distinction between the philosopher and then the non-philosopher. Like, philosopher contemplates, then there's like the auxiliaries, and then there's the the producers, right? They don't really engage in any contemplation, and Plato seems to be like, oh well, philosopher's better. I don't know if it's exactly the same in Plotinus, but it does seem to be in like sort of the Gnostics who followed Plotinus around the same time. They sort of thought the same thing. They sort of viewed people hierarchically, where there's the people who know, and then there's the benighted people who don't. It seems like Christianity, though, one novelty that it introduced is more of a like sort of egalitarian access to God. Like, everyone can access God. You don't need to have superior cognitive abilities to be in a relationship with the divine. So is that your reading? Like, would you agree with that, or am I missing something? Because it seems like I agree with you. There's been this sort of flattening out of a hierarchical worldview, but it seems like part of that is actually the result of Christianity.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's a good point, which reminds me of what Chesterton says in his Orthodoxy, that Christian virtues are even more dangerous than vices when they are separate. I mean, running wild everywhere. And so Chesterton's point was that when we had this coherent view of reality in antiquity, late antiquity and the Middle Ages, maybe early modernity, everything was in place, including some Christian revolution, quite revolutionary ideas, metaphysical ideas. But in modernity, there was this disintegration of this worldview, and then various elements of it started to run amok. So, for instance, the idea of equality, which, of course, it gave us democracy and all of that. And we live in a democratic universe in the sense that, you know, all electrons are equal and they have the same right to exist. and there is God, like this constitutional monarch over all of this. But we don't have, you know, the aristocracy of angels anymore, because who knows, who wants aristocracy now? We all are equal. So in a sense, some parts of Christian culture which became exaggerated and I don't want to sound too critical, but I think Protestantism contributed a lot to that, and certain aspects became exaggerated. And one of them is the idea that, you know, there is no hierarchy. But interestingly, Plotinus says something very similar, which makes you think whether, I mean, we don't really know anything about his childhood and his youth, but I have this crazy idea, which I cannot prove, of course, that he must have been in contact with, in Alexandria, he must have been in contact with some Christians, not only Christian Gnostics, but, you know, Alexandria, right? So it would be very weird if he, you know, if he lived in some kind of lockdown in his apartment and never walked out. But he met people, because you have these ideas in Plotinus which are fully developed in Christian Platonism and nowhere else except in Plotinus, which is very strange. So, for instance, Plotinus criticizes the Gnostics in 2.9 in his treatise, the last part of his great treatise against the Gnostics. He says, you know, these are narcissists, you know, arrogant narcissists, because they say, you know, that some people can be saved, they can return to the intelligible world, and they are better than the cosmic powers, the cosmic gods. But, you know, the majority of people, they are not even, they don't even have, you know, pneuma, the spirit or the soul. And Plotinus is usually a very calm guy, but in 2.9, he's really angry. He says, you know, these people are horrible because they come to a simple man and they tell him, you know, you're greater than the sun and the moon and the stars and the gods. You are the son of God. And now, and all these other people, they are worse than you. And Plotinus says, every soul is a child of this father. So, you know, it's a Christian could say that easily. Of course, Plotinus means by that something different, I think, than, for instance, the Gospel of John or the first letter of John. He means natural being, image and likeness. But he says every soul, pasa psyche, every soul is a child of this father. And in 1.6, the first treatise he ever wrote on beauty, he says, you have to let everything go. You have to go inside and look inwards. You have to awaken inner sight, which everyone possesses, but very few use. This is one of his famous quotes. Again, he says, metaphysically, we are structured in absolute equality. Everyone has nous, intellect, and the capacity to contemplate. But then Plotinus, of course, says there is a hierarchy, because some people, you know, they have more virtue and they are more advanced in contemplation. And he even says that in the intelligible realm, in his heaven, there is a hierarchy of intellects who are closer to the good and they are far farther from the good. So he believes in hierarchy in all respects, but he also says everyone can have access to God. And this is, again, the stance of Christian Platonists. Even Clement, you know, or Origen, sometimes, you know, Clement is interpreted in this Gnostic sense, but they were Christians, so they couldn't say, you know, that there is the elite which has access to God and an ordinary person doesn't. But they believe that, you know, of course, there is this participatory hierarchical structure. Like again, in the Areopagite, you can see that. So when Christian philosophers contemplate, every Christian, in a sense, the uneducated Christians, they participate in that contemplation, just like when a bishop is celebrating the divine liturgy, the entire congregation participates in that. And now we say everyone should be a bishop. I want to be a priest, right? Why women can't be priests? That's unfair. This is very, very Christian, but at the same time, this is very unplatonic, because the whole idea of those levels of reality participating in each other, being, images of higher archetypes, and everything is, coherent and unified ultimately by the good. So I agree, this is a Christian development, but it's a modern development.
I think one thing that's been lost too is that the term hierarchy has become a kind of problematic word for us because of this egalitarianism, whereas really, Dionysius, who coined the term, it's an entirely benevolent arrangement that those who have more share with those who have less, and in a way that's how our world is organized, and we don't question it, right? I mean, if I'm new on the job, my supervisor has more knowledge and I respect that, and he has someone above. Like, we can't really avoid hierarchy on some level. It's just the way reality structures itself, right? We can't all be bosses, and that would be a disaster.
Yeah, but for Plotinus and for the entire Western metaphysical tradition, this is the hierarchy of love. This is all based on love, or the overflowing of goodness and the loving return to the archetype of the images. It's all driven by love, by eros and agape, if you want to distinguish between these. And of course, in modernity, this was transformed into the hierarchy of oppression, of violence, of authoritarian, rule. And of course, again, the fall of the soul. Yes, we do that. We transform. We don't transform natural hierarchies. We just distort natural hierarchies in this way. But it doesn't have to mean that hierarchy in itself is evil, right? So it's but again, I think it's very important. I can see more and more people interested in that. It's not about just coming back to the Middle Ages or to the antiquity. It's not possible. It's just not possible. But we have to own this tradition and use this tradition to think today about our contemporary world and society and our lives, and just forget this period where it was just thrown into a dustbin as a kind of superstitious phase of human evolution, in favor of this absurd, illogical, irrational, strange view of the world as this material mechanism. This is really, I mean, of course, if you really dive into Plotinus, I mean, after a couple of years, you can see the insanity of this all. But our children are taught that at schools, and we see this flowing from the screens and the television and the internet all the time. There's this false view, very narrow, very limited, ultimately, I think, irrational view of reality. So, but Plotinus, this was a metaphysical drama of, the fall of the soul and a possible return to the one.
I mean, one thing.
Well, maybe. Oh yeah. Sorry. Dan, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm still a little hung up on the hierarchy because it's a topic I'm always fascinated with. But I always go back to, Hadot was one of my favorites as well. Levels of the self is how he talks about it in one of his lovely little book. And I keep wanting to, write a paper on even the Dionysian hierarchy, is interpreting this as some sort of interior hierarchy, that maybe this is not necessarily fixed, but that you can actually ascend the hierarchy. It's not that some people are destined to have a very limited view of the divine and some are higher, but perhaps there's a way in which we can see this in an interior way. And then I was thinking, related to that, as an Orthodox Christian, very strong hierarchy of metropolitan, bishop, priest, and often the monk is the one with, is actually fairly low on the hierarchy. A monk may not be a priest or anything, and yet often the monk is the one who's the contemplative with deep and will be like the elder. So there's a way in which, I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's hierarchy a lot more, I think, richer and more flexible and open to exploration. Maybe that's all I want to say.
Yeah, but you're right. But it's also true what Quentin said, that we forgot this revolutionary quality of Christianity, which but the church fathers, they felt it still. Like St. John Chrysostom, he says in his homilies on the Gospel of John, he says, we have this uneducated fisherman who was given the lofty, noble revelations higher than whatever Plato or Plotinus could achieve by their own efforts. And he was an educated fisherman. He was, stinking with fish. And so Chrysostom, he really wants to emphasize that there is this kind of upside down quality to Christianity. And I can understand that for some people, that means it's irreconcilable with pagan Platonism. But the miracle was that it was reconciled by Augustine, Gregory of Nyssa, and St. Maximus. And they managed to reconcile this traditional hierarchical non-Christian view of reality with this Christian revolution, in which simple fishermen contemplate the abyss of the divine. And that's fascinating. So I think Christian Platonism is even more fascinating than pagan Platonism, because it's very strange. The incarnation and the sense of history, which is nowhere to be found in Plotinus. There is no sense of evolution or history in Plotinus. The world is eternal, and there is no development. How could something which is an image of perfection develop, says Plotinus? And in Christianity, we have history and progress and evolution. It's funny when you take these nowadays, which are entirely and purely Christian inventions, like progress and evolution. You cannot find more Christian concepts, really. I mean, where is evolution or where is progress in Plotinus, Proclus, Plato, Aristotle? There's nothing like that. So I think it's very interesting, this tension between Christianity and earlier pagan Platonism, and later pagan Platonism. But I think the idea that it can be put together is really fascinating. Now, Plotinus, of course, would be appalled by what I'm saying. He would reject it outright. So yeah, the idea of incarnation of God, of course, it doesn't make any sense in Plotinus.
Great. Well, so it would be maybe in a subsequent question we can start getting more into the concept of the fall of the soul and how that contrasts with the descent of being. But maybe before we get there, I think it'd be really nice if we kind of discussed a little bit your identification of sort of three key principles in Platonian metaphysics. You talk about the principle of the microcosm, the imaging principle, and the principle of triadic selfhood. So these are kind of three, in your eyes, like three central sort of principles that govern Plotinus's metaphysics. And you go into a lot of fascinating depth on those in the first chapter. So I was kind of curious, maybe we could kind of go through those a little bit, introduce everyone to those.
Well, we already talked about the mirroring principle, in the sense that everything is an image. Only the one which is unknowable, you cannot know it. In a sense, you cannot contemplate it, but in another sense, you can. But the one is not an image, that's fullness of reality. But whatever is created by the one is an image. So intellect and being, this is the first, the most real image which shares in the one, but it's already a multiplicity. So the hierarchy is that the lower you go, the more multiplicity you get, the less of unity and the less of perfection and the less of existence and the less of consciousness and all of that. So intellect, which is being, which Plotinus calls the all, so it's everything that exists, the entire realm of real being. This is intellect being. This is the closest image of the one, and then it expresses itself in soul, and soul is an image of intellect, less unified, filled with what Plotinus calls logoi, taking it from the Stoics. So he says logoi are sort of lower level forms. Platonic forms exist in intellect. Intellect and being is an organism of Plato's forms, really, the living being from Timaeus. The image of it is soul. Soul is an organism of logoi. Plotinus says it's the logos of logoi. Logoi are called by Plotinus unfolded forms. They are unfolded because they are less condensed, they are less unified. And soul produces nature. Nature is also filled with logoi. Those are lower logoi for Plotinus. He starts to sound almost as Proclus when he analytically divides these levels. So nature produces what we call reality, what we call the universe, quite erroneously. So nature produces sensible universe, sensible realm, which is, of course, the most disintegrated, or it's not disintegrated really, but it's multiplicity at the lowest level. And then the level of matter, of course, it's nothing like what we call matter, or the 17th century philosophers and physicists would call matter. Matter is just it doesn't have magnitude or a great mirror in which sensible images are reflected. So this is this hierarchical world in which every level participates in a higher level because it's an image of the higher archetype. So everything is a mirror in a sense. Intellect itself is a mirror filled with mirrors of the one. Soul is a mirror of intellect filled with souls who are mirrors of intellects. And nature is a mirror of soul, and physical, sensible universe is a mirror of soul, and so on. So we are in a chamber of mirrors, really. So the problem is how to distinguish between a mirror and an archetype. That's one of the problems. The microcosm principle means that it's almost every individual intellect and every individual soul contains everything in itself, but by participation. So in a sense, every one of these mirrors all the other mirrors. So you have hierarchical mirroring, and you have vertical mirroring, and you have horizontal mirroring. So my soul in a way mirrors all your souls and all the souls of animals and things like that. So in a sense, every soul is a microcosm containing in itself all the levels of reality, from the one down to the sensible realm. We have bodies, of course, and and our bodies participate. And I use this distinction between horizontal participation and vertical participation. So, for instance, my body participates horizontally in the entire physical universe. So my body, because it's a body, it's located in space and time, it's a part of the universe, of the physical universe. It's a kind of participation because there is sympathy, as Plotinus says, and a deep connection between every physical being and every other physical being in the entire universe. So this horizontal participation, but my body participates vertically in my soul, because body is an expression of the soul. And actually it's kind of interesting that Saint Gregory of Nyssa, in his On the Making of Man, he says that the body is a mirror of a mirror, because the soul is a mirror of God and the body is a mirror image of the soul. So this is also in Christian Platonism the same view. So the body vertically participates in soul because it's an image of a soul, and horizontally in the physical universe. My soul soul now in the sense of imagination, the senses, the emotions, it participates vertically in reason. Reason is a higher level of being, and it participates horizontally in nature. And so every level of being is a microcosm. In this sense, Plotinus says everything is inside ourselves, but we are not equal to, the cosmic principles of nature, soul, intellect. Plotinus he's not that kind of philosopher. He hated the Gnostics for claiming that, we are superior to the powers of nature. No, we are inferior to the powers of nature. There is a lot of humility in Plotinus, I would say, but still we can participate even in the good in some limited way, it seems. So this is the principle of the microcosm, and so I argue that my body participates horizontally in the universe. My soul, with the faculties of imagination, emotions, senses, participates in nature. My reason is a part of soul, because soul is a cosmic reason, Stoic logos. Intellect, my individual intellect, is a part of the great intellect, of the divine intellect being. And there is something in me which, and here I'm not writing about this in the book, it's a very difficult idea, but there is something in me which is, we cannot say it's a part of the one, because the one doesn't have parts. But Plotinus says there is something like the one in the soul, or the image of the one in the soul. In any case, this is the principle of microcosm. And the third principle is the principle of triadic selfhood, which is really Plotinus's reinterpretation of Plato's Sophists, or the great kinds, megista gene, the Sophist. So Plato says that there are 5 kinds, the greatest Platonic forms, being, then toon, then we have, Plato says we have stasis, rest, kinesis, movement, we have auton, tauton, the same, and we have to heteron, that is difference, or the different, or otherness, whatever you wanna put it. And Plotinus is doing interesting things with this. So he is, first of all, he's changing the order. So he's saying that kinesis is before stasis, so movement before rest, the difference before identity, and he kind of smuggles into these 5 the 6th principle, which is intelligible matter, because for Plotinus, being is the limitation and giving measure to intelligible matter, in the same way that rest is the measure of movement and identity is the measure of difference. So he comes up with eventually like 6 pairs: intelligible matter and being, movement and rest, difference and identity. And I think they, interestingly, if you look into them, they correspond with the 3 subjectivity, namely being is the self, or I am, or the core of our selfhood, while movement and rest, they correspond to love or desire or will, while difference and identity correspond to knowledge. Because if you look into Plotinus, he really associates, for instance, movement with love, because he says movements is a movement towards the good. And for any Platonist, the movement toward love or knowledge is obviously possible only when you have difference in identity, because any kind of knowledge, and you have this in Aristotle, any kind of knowledge is a combination of difference and identity. If you have just identity, there is no knowledge. And if there is only difference, there is also no knowledge. Because, if you say a tree is a plant, you're basically combining difference and identity, because you say tree is identical to the plant while still being different, because otherwise I wouldn't make that claim. It's not a tautology, right?
Right.
So the triadic selfhood is like the core self, which is intelligible matter, potentiality formed into a being. This is the self. And then the self expresses itself in further two powers: the power of loving, which is the movement towards rest in the good, and the other power is difference, which is subsumed into identity, and this is knowledge. And so this is the triadic selfhood. And it exists in the great intellect being at the cosmic level, of course, and it exists in every soul in the form of faculties, as we call them now, faculties of cognition and will, and a sort of core self.
Great. And so the descent of being, that would kind of refer to that mirroring downward from the one to intellect, soul, nature, and matter, right? That's kind of what we're speaking of there in terms of the descent of being. And you're kind of emphasizing in your book that the fall is not the same as that. And a lot of your book is about it's really focusing on the fall. So yeah, can you kind of just explain that distinction for us, the difference there?
Yeah, I think it's it's because of Gnosticism, really, that Plotinus is making that distinction, because the Gnostics, at least what Hans Jonas calls, the Egyptian Syrian Gnosticism, or the Alexandrian Gnosticism, this particular branch of Gnosticism describes the descent of being as some, like the catastrophe in heaven. We know the most about Valentinus and his view of, like Sophia hubristically wanting to contemplate the highest God, and then she falls and brings forth this horrible fetus, the demiurge, and the passions of Sophia constitute material elements, and this is how the cosmos is created in Gnosticism. And Plotinus rejects that, although at times, very rarely, well, he clearly knew a lot about Gnosticism. Sometimes he says, oh, maybe it would be better for intellect if it were never outside of the good, or something like that. So there are moments when Plotinus kind of, makes that almost Gnostic observation is not that wonderful. But I interpret this as something said from the perspective of this catastrophe, which is the fall of the soul. But on the whole, I think Plotinus is saying that the descent of being is a natural movement which is due to what the one is, because the one is good, and there is no envy whatsoever in the one who is good. This is Plato's Timaeus, of course. There can be no envy in the perfect goodness. When there is no envy, there is infinite sharing. By the way, it doesn't mean that creation is necessary for Plotinus. He wrote an entire treatise to argue that it is not. So creation is free, but creation is not some accident. Creation is linked to the nature of the first principle, and that nature is this overflowing of goodness and this giving. So on that principle, the descent of being, or the creation, as in Christianity would say, although Plotinus uses the word poiesis, and poiein, which means to make, and Septuagint uses exactly the same word to describe creation. So the creation of Plotinus cannot be something bad, because the good cannot produce anything bad. So the descent of being is just like the proliferation of the images out of the single source. This is the hierarchical descent of being. But the fall is something different. And but sometimes Plotinus doesn't. Well, he never says, "Now I'm speaking about the fall. Watch out." Now I'm speaking about the descent of being. No, he's just saying things like, well, everyone was talking like that. For instance, that, beware of the body because the body can ensnare us, and people say, oh, Plotinus was a typical Platonist. He hated the body. Well, everyone said that. St. Paul said that. Augustine said that. The Desert Fathers said it. Everyone said that in a certain sense. Of course, the body is a snare. The body is a problem. But at the same time, the body is something good. And Plotinus affirms that. So it's difficult sometimes, but I use this interpretation where in certain places I interpret Plotinus's lamentations on the evils of the material world and the body as his lamentations about the fall of the soul into the body, which is non-natural. It's not natural, it's unnatural. But the descent of being is perfectly normal, natural, and good thing, so that the whole universe is good, but it's worse than intellect, obviously. And intellect is good, but worse than the good. So the descent of being is what Christians would and did name creation. And the fall is what happens only to individual intellects or individual souls, human souls, not to other souls, not to the cosmic soul, not to the souls and intellects of the stars and the moon and the sun. But we fell, or we fall. And Plotinus then gives a really marvelous, intricate description of what it really is. So on the one hand, it's almost like an exaggeration of the descent. So the fall is almost like, it's almost a descent of being, on steroids, something like that. But from another perspective, it's something so unnatural that it's the complete reverse of this hierarchical, harmonious, outflow of images. Because my interpretation in the book of the fall is that the fall is basically narrowing down, and you can see that this refrain and not refrain, this like a repeated phrase and image in Plotinus all the time, that we wanted to be a part instead to be the whole. For instance, we loved the part so much that we rejected the whole. For instance, this is his main idea. In other places, he says that the source of the fall is pride, tolma, kind of audacity or pride, which then, of course, Augustine absorbed and the entire later Christian tradition, that the soul starts to move around itself. So the soul becomes the center, and it rejects the true center, which is the good. So the good is the center. So the soul should revolve around the good, but the soul rejects that movement and starts to move around itself. So it becomes a little self, and this is what Plotinus calls pride. It doesn't require any embodiment, any senses. It's just a purely spiritual event. And of course, Augustine would say, yeah, exactly. That's what happened to Lucifer, because you don't need any desire of, just you reject the entire order of reality with God as its center, and you say, I want to be everything for myself. And this has catastrophic consequences, but this is a narrowing down of our selfhood. We just don't want to participate, being open to the entire reality. We just want to build a little bubble for ourselves, and the bubble solidifies, and it's very hard to break out. And I also talk about different aspects of the fall, like the fall of the self, the fall of love, and the fall of knowledge.
Right. Which is
yeah.
Oh, sorry, and that's corresponding to because you set it up with your discussion of the great kinds, where as you mentioned earlier, being corresponds to the self. Movement and rest corresponding to love, and then what was the difference in identity corresponding to knowledge. So we have that triadic dimension of the self, the being, knowledge, or being, desire, or love and knowledge. And then so you kind of flesh out the fall in terms of that triad. And in general, it's kind of like you're making, I mean, it's that's one of the really great things about the book, is that it's so detailed in its description of, I'm trying to remember how you put it, as like the fall is the central fact of human experience. And so it's something that we can describe the fall, we can flesh it out in a very detailed way in terms of this triad. Sorry, am I cutting out, or or am I still here? Sorry.
Yeah, there are some interruptions. Yeah, but I get what you mean about Plotinus gives a lot of images to describe the fall. And well, one thing that is interesting in Plotinus, that by using the great kinds, he does what Plato didn't do, namely he sort of points out that these potential or material kinds, like movement and difference, they contain like the seed of fall in them, because in the good there is no difference, and there is no movement, and there is no potentiality. So it's interesting that if you speak about identity or identity or rest, Plotinus often speaks in those terms about the one. For instance, when he describes the highest union with the one, it's all about rest and the identity of ourself with the one. And he says there is no difference, there is no movement. So movement and difference and this potentiality of intelligible matter, these are potential problems in heaven for Plotinus. But on the cosmic scale, they are balanced. So because difference is balanced by identity and united with it, because movement always finds rest, because intelligible matter is always given measure by the good, and it becomes being. There is no cosmic fall like in Gnosticism, or like in Christianity, in fact, where the fall of angels is something that Plotinus would probably object to, I think, but it's a consequence of his thought. And Augustine, in his description of the fall of angels, just follows, and already Arthur Hilary Armstrong already wrote a short article in 1950s or 60s about how Augustine, describing the fall of angels, is following strictly Plotinus's description of the formation of intellect. So that the lower you go in reality, the more difference in identity, movement, and rest, the more they are divorced from each other. So for instance, in the physical realm, you find things which are either moving or standing still. While in the intelligible world, everything is moving and everything is standing still. Or here we find bodies which are separate from themselves. So the power of difference is so great that one tree cannot stand in exactly the same place as another tree. The power of difference is so prevalent in the sensible universe, while in the intelligible universe, Plotinus says, I can be in the same intelligible place as you, and in fact I am. He says we are all in the same place, we are sharing the same space. So what in the intelligible world is this beautiful harmony of polarities, in the lower levels it is less so. So our soul falls because of the exaggerated movement, exaggerated difference, and exaggerated potentiality of the self. So I think it's a very interesting idea. And then he shows, how these different aspects, what role they play in the fall. So for instance, he says that one of the results of the fall is that we see the world as external. We see what we know as external to the knower, while in intellect, the known and the knower are united. This is the Aristotelian principle, of course. knowledge is the identity of the knower and the known, while we experience the opposite. I mean, look at the whole epistemology of modernity. This is pure fallen cognition. I mean, there are objects which are outside of our consciousness, and somehow we experience images, representations of these real objects, all of that. Plotinus believes this is a result of the fall. And when it comes to love, he says that the fall of love is that we desire lower goods more than the higher ones. So we desire sensible goods, for instance, more than the spiritual ones. But also, interestingly, Plotinus' own sense of time is the result of the fall of our movement or desire or love, because he says we create time by projecting the future. So our happiness is always ahead of us, while in intellect, in the intelligible world, our happiness, intellect is eternal, while in time, our good is always escaping us. So we are chasing it. And so all of it are like different angles from which he looks at the fall, but the fall is always narrowing down. So it's narrowing down of our perspective. We feel only a tiny part of a huge universe. This is the fall of the self. We feel that we are little knowers looking out at the objects. Again, the fall of our knowledge. And we feel that we are surrounded by the goods, and we want to grasp these goods. We want to get them in order to fill the void inside. And this is the fall of love. And contemplation and the whole philosophical journey is a remedy to it. So how to open up, how to be able to be aware of the whole again, and break out of this little cell that we created for ourselves.
Yeah, so just to be clear then, it's like the fall of the soul, it's not referring to the descent of being in general, and it's also not referring more specifically to just the fact that we're embodied, the fact that we are in flesh. Instead, it's like it's more of a factor of our experience, in the sense of it's something that shows up in our lived experience. You can kind of identify it in terms of maybe I'll turn off my video in case that'll help me not cut out. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
So basically, like, anyway, so the point is that, it's not just that we're embodied. That's not really, what the fall references. Instead, it's more of like, it has these experiential results, but then also it's maybe more as a result of our attitude or how we live our life. It's our turn. Well, basically, it's due to the fact that we turn away from contemplation, right? Isn't that the basic idea? Yeah.
We turn away from contemplation because contemplation is this opening up to the whole, to the entire being, and ultimately to the one. But the problem of embodiment, it is a problem for Plotinus, and he expresses his frustration with Plato. Although Plato is a great master, Plotinus says, well, Plato was saying contradictory things. On the one hand, in Phaedrus and Phaedo, he says that, we fell into the body, and the body is something we should get rid of. But in the Timaeus, obviously not. In the Timaeus, souls are governors of the body. They are the souls are supposed to take care of the bodies. In the Timaeus, there is the soul. The fall happens to the embodied soul when the circular movements are disturbed. And again, the whole Republic testifies to the goodness of embodiment. I mean, that getting out of the cave has nothing to do with getting out of the body. It wouldn't make any sense. Why to write about philosophers governing the ideal polity if the purpose of philosophy was to escape from that horrible body? No, it's there is a tension in Plato, primarily Phaedrus Phaedo on the one hand, and the Republic and Timaeus on the other. And Plotinus is aware of that, and he has a problem with that. I think he leans towards the Republic Timaeus in the sense that he believes that we are supposed to take care of our bodies, at least temporarily. And the fall is that we pay too much attention to our body, and not that the fact that we have a body. He's clear on that in many places. But sometimes, of course, he uses the language of Plato from Phaedrus and Phaedo. This is a beautiful language, beautiful rhetoric of, being in the body like in a prison, or the losing of wings and falling into the earth. Yeah, so I'm not saying there is no tension, but again, the same tension is in the New Testament, I'm afraid, and we have to take context into it. So, is the world evil? The flesh fighting against the spirit. This is not so different from that. Of course, I'm not saying it's the same, but we shouldn't, try to get rid of all the tensions. It's impossible, because our condition is filled with tensions. That's the fallen reality of humanity.
Does anyone want to jump in here, especially because my my internet's breaking out? Does anyone want to hop in, ask any questions?
I can hear you very well. I can hear you now very well without any interruptions.
Okay,
well, I was going to bring up, Mateusz, as you just mentioned, that he's working through between the Phaedo versus Timaeus. The other way I've been looking at it, maybe Plotinus even says this himself, you can perhaps confirm, that there's something perspectival going on. Is that one way? I think the tension is there. I don't think it's necessarily needs to be resolved. I'm okay with some tensions being there, but I mean, from one point of view, right? From the Timaeus point of view, we need this. We need souls to enter into the material world in order for the richness of the good to realize itself, and yet it's also unavoidably, we can't avoid the fact that it's kind of better to remain above. It's less limiting to be up there, as it were. And so in that sense, it's kind of the language of fall makes sense in that context.
Yes, well, Plotinus definitely, he says that our bodies put us at risk. So, but at the same time, he says, but the body of the cosmic soul doesn't put her at risk. So again, it's not having a body as such, because for him, soul or nature, he also has a body. Like he believes that the universe is a God who has a soul and a body, but is not at risk. Everything is balanced and harmonized. Our bodies put us at risk, I think, because again, they are partial. He emphasized they are partial, and we are partial, and we have this potentiality, for excessive difference, excessive movement. There is this restlessness. Plotinus famously says that polypragmosune, so our souls are kind of restless. And then Augustine, of course, uses this beginning of Confessions, speaking that we are restless until we rest in you. So there is this metaphysical restlessness inherent in us, and our bodies put that at risk. I think that's fair to say. So theoretically, if we were never embodied, we would be safe. And Plotinus says, well, but we are embodied, right? And this is the fact of reality. We have to deal with that. This is, of course, a very interesting question, because the Gnostics would answer, the embodiment is a result of some metaphysical catastrophe. We were not supposed to be embodied. But Plotinus says, following Plato, embodiment is the completion of the perfection of reality, in a way. And Plotinus believes that, and Christians of course go much further, because not only they accept on the base of Genesis the goodness of creation and this kind of the descent of being into the material world. So there is the creation of the heaven and earth, so the creation of the intelligible world and the sensible material world. But in Christianity, because of the incarnation, embodiment, the body, the physical world is given this revolutionary significance, upside down in a sense, everything, because once the body is in God after Christ's ascension, something weird is accomplished in the order of creation, which again for Plotinus it would be ridiculous. I mean, in what sense? I mean, in what sense the body of Christ is now in God? I mean, I don't think he could really understand that through the lens of his metaphysics. Yeah, but it's not like a purely spiritual metaphysics looking down on the body and the material world. Not at all.
I agree. Yeah. I wonder if in Proclus we start to get more of that, more of an explicit doctrine of the goodness, goodness of matter and so on. In terms of reading the two, I much prefer Plotinus, and but there's a few little things that in Proclus I think that kind of help to maybe correct Plotinus a little bit, especially his view of matter.
Plotinus becomes very, I mean, in his polemic against the Gnostics, he sounds really radical, like in this great treatise, which is 3.8, so on contemplation. Then you have 5.8 on the intelligible beauty, 5.5 on the intelligibles not being outside of intellect, and 2.9 against the Gnostics. So in 5.8 he says everything in the universe is a form, everything is beautiful, everything is good, and it's even difficult to find matter under all these beautiful forms, and matter itself is also a form. So Plotinus is having these almost ecstatic exclamations of the goodness of everything. Even matter, he says, even physical matter is a kind of form. It also participates in goodness and beauty. While in other places he will say, of course, that it's the principle of privation, the principle of evil, or even evil itself, understood, of course, as steresis agathou, so the privation of the good, not some positive evil force.
No, fair enough. Yeah.
And I was wondering about what Plotinus does with the greatest kinds, where he sort of reinterprets them as sort of following a limit and then a thing limited structure. Do much with the Philebus. I know in the Philebus there's the fourfold division into, I couldn't make much sense of the passage, but it's limit, unlimited, mixture of limit and unlimited, and then the cause of the mixture. And this seems to characterize all reality in Plato. Does Plotinus make any use?
Yeah, I didn't study that in particular, but he uses that language certainly. But he's often using Plato very selectively. So he's using a phrase or a term or an image, not necessarily paying attention to the context. But yeah, for him, the good is the cause of limit. Also, in some sense, the limit or the indefinite dyad of Plato's unwritten doctrines. So the indefinite dyad or intelligible matter is the unlimited, the principle of the unlimited. It's a spiritual principle. It's not physical matter. Yes, so the good imposes the limit on the unlimited. So the intellect and being the entire intelligible world, because the intelligible world is intellect and soul. So this entire intelligible world is, in a sense, a mixture of limit and unlimited, but the mixture happens at every level, because, of course, in Timaeus, the mixture is about the world soul and the universe. But Plotinus uses this freely as a principle, because you have always this potentiality and materiality sort of given form. by the archetype. Yeah, so the good is, of course, the cause of limit. And in a sense, good is, Plotinus says, he is the measure of everything. He is the limit of everything, although he is limitless, because Plotinus famously believes that the one is formless. It doesn't have any form. It is not a being. It doesn't have any intrinsic limit. It is limit of limited things being unlimited itself, right? So yeah, I think there is a lot of Philebus in the Enneads in that sense.
Great. So
Yeah,
Patrick,
you wanted to ask?
Yeah, please, Patrick. Yeah.
Only if I'm not interrupting. I just had to.
Oh no, please, yeah, go for it, Patrick. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. While we were on the topic of the greatest kinds, I've always been curious about the role of being in among the Magistra, because he, of course, in 5.1 he takes up the Parmenidean claim that all things for all things thinking is being, the identity of thought and being. And I have something that I haven't been able to really get my mind around, and it sounds like you've addressed some of these questions, which is that thought in a way establishes being, and that being in a sense kind of has this receptive role for thinking, and being is that which thought beholds, and is for thinking. And you were mentioning earlier about how it's kind of this the core of selfhood. I was wondering if you can elaborate more on the relationship between thinking and being in Plotinus. I'm sure that's a immense project, but and I'm sure there'll be more in your book.
Well, the first thing is that in different passages, and I give examples of them and analyze them in the book, he describes the sort of the procession of the great. So he doesn't always mention all the kinds, and he also plays with their order. So he doesn't always put movement and rest before the difference in identity. Sometimes the other way around. So he doesn't have a particular agenda for what comes first. I think in general, he claims very interestingly that love precedes knowledge. And this is what Augustine didn't take from him, because Augustine, Augustine knew some parts of Plato's Meno through Cicero. And in Meno, famously, we cannot love something that we don't know, because if we find it, how can we know that this is what we love? So Augustine says knowledge always precedes love. So being, knowledge, love. This is the order in St. Augustine. But in Plotinus, often it's like the very first moment of creation is that out of the one, something is made by the one, and it turns in desire, in pure desire, in pure like loving impulse, it turns towards its source, but it doesn't have knowledge. Knowledge comes later. So there is a kind of primacy of love, which is very strange in Plotinus. Of course, whatever comes out of the one is some kind of intellectual principle. So in that sense, I would say that intellect precedes being, although in some accounts, Plotinus says that, intellect comes later. Intellect understood as this knowledge of difference in identity comes after being. It's generated by being. And Plotinus sometimes says, intellect has to have something to think. Intellect has something to think, hence being. But being has to be thought, so intellect. So he kind of sees this as two sides of one coin. In this sense, as I argued at the beginning, everything contemplation, because being is always contemplated. There is no conceivable being in Plotinus which is not contemplated. But when Plotinus speaks of being, it's not some kind of devoid of consciousness, dead being. That it's out of question. It's just those things are just popping out of this source. He says, you can see, being and difference and identity and movement and rest, and it's like a cosmic dance for him, and he describes this differently in different places. I know it's a great debate later in the Middle Ages whether intellect precedes being or being intellect. Yeah, but of course God is intellect. So in Christian thought, intellect always precedes being. When in Plotinus, it's very complex. I would say.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. But I would say that this intelligible matter or this potentiality that is the first product of the good. This is a kind of intellect. Plotinus sometimes says it's a non-seeing seeing, or some kind of aoristos nous, some kind of limitless intellect, or a desire to think, or what else? Or it is something which will become intellect. So it's like potential intellect. This is what comes first. Potential intellect, some kind of primordial kind of awareness, which becomes a fully fledged intellect only later in the interaction with being. But I would say in some sense it is already some kind of intellect.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Patrick. Appreciate it. So I want to be sensitive with time, but Mateusz, I can't resist it. Could you bring up maybe again, kind of just talk a bit more about how this is just the first book in what would you say it was a trilogy, or?
No, it's just well, to be honest, maybe I shouldn't, but to be honest, I wrote also I wrote a book including the final contemplation of the good.
Okay.
But it was like 600 pages. And I was told, no way anyone publishes it. I mean, maybe in the 19th century, some German publishing house published such a. Yeah, but the Cambridge University Press, I mean, I'm grateful they published, it's almost 400 pages. I mean, it's a bit much for today's standards. Usually today's monographs are supposed to have like 200 pages, 250, something like that. Yeah, but so it's written in a sense, but I want to, of course, revise it and think it through again, because I'm constantly seeing some new things when I'm discussing the books with my friends, and I want to see also how people react to the book, of course. So in the next few years I would publish the sequel about the experience of the one, which will continue the sort of methodology of this book and follow up on everything that I said in the book. But I'm open to surprises, because I'm still thinking about this and how to approach the one, the contemplation of the one. Yeah, but basically this is the next step. After soul, comes intellect, the contemplation of intellect, and then contemplation of the good. And what I find a striking difference, which I kind of explore, is that up to a certain point, contemplation is just it's one of the claims of the book, that contemplation is not gaining something that we don't have. The contemplation is something we forgot and we remember, or it's something we are not aware of, but it's still going on. So in a sense, contemplation is just recovering a states of consciousness which we have in ourselves. It's activating them. But there is a certain point in which Plotinus says that our efforts cannot bring us further on journey. And he starts to say strange things, like that the one has to lift us up or pull us into itself, or we need something coming from the one in order to contemplate. And it becomes even more interesting. So I'm going to explore this, because I think the highest contemplation, Plotinus, it's not a natural contemplation in the sense, it's not that we are already in that state and we just have to pay attention, remove the obstacles, and sort of release what is in us. I think the last stage of contemplation is something given from the one. Plotinus doesn't explain how, why, it's just given or not given, and he doesn't have any detailed explanation of that. So that will be the sequel.
Wow, fascinating. Fascinating. Well, thanks so much again, Mateusz, for coming on and answering our questions. Sorry if I broke up. I just want to say, yeah, thanks again, Mateusz, for coming on and answering all these questions. Yeah. The book, like I said, it's absolutely fascinating. I, recommend everyone, of course, check it out, and we'll look forward to the sequel as well. So thank you again so much for coming on. Thank you
very much for this wonderful conversation, for having me, and all these questions. Very, very interesting. And it's always good to talk to people, because it really opens up your perspective. So I'm grateful for inviting me and talking to me, and reading my book, because at least you, Samuel, you read the book. It's not short, as I said, so I really appreciate the effort, and I'm glad that you seem to enjoyed it. Absolutely. Yeah.